Thank you, Mark. Okay. Yes, thank you, Mark, especially, and to the organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to come here today. As stated, my name is Rachael Floreani, an associate professor of engineering, food science, and I'm also co-founder of a small startup, Burlington Bio. And the idea there is to translate our work out of the lab to the industry to do what all of us want to do, to have some sort of impact. I have spent the past 20 years studying tissue engineering. Specifically, I was working in orthopedics. And then in 2020, I had a previous student, Dr. Tahir, come into my lab. He introduced me to the world of cultivated meat. I had no idea what it was. I took a deep dive into the internet, and I cried, and I instantly knew what my new passion was. So my passion for food and nutrition equality motivates me every day to do what I do. The statistics on the board behind me are from my own state, the state of Vermont in the US. We are known for our agriculture, for our cheese, for our ice cream, for our milk, and yet children are still going hungry. We must do better. Overall, my goal is to generate a better understanding of how to evolve our food system in general. The inspiration for my work comes from nature, the ultimate engineer, and in my laboratory, we study and engineer biomaterials. My team blends experience in biology, food science, mechanical engineering to create designer hydrogels. I used my experience in tissue engineering, solid mechanics, and manufacturing to focus on food. Going into it, because of my experience, I knew the technical risk of creating scaffolds for cultivated meat. And we can all appreciate the challenge of blending different materials to optimize porosity, stiffness, cell expansion, nutrients, and taste. Therefore, we went into this work knowing our objectives. Specifically here, I will focus on the fabrication techniques of various biomaterials using 3 current generation of materials. So just to give a little bit of background, I didn't mention much about the title of my talk, whey protein. Yes, that does come from cows, and it can be quite provocative, but I hope by the end of this talk you will see why I started here and where we are going. So whey protein contains a rich blend of amino acids. It is high in nutritional value. There's trace amounts of lipids and disaccharides, and by the way, whey protein is not one protein. It is actually the word given to everything that comes out of a pipe after dairy processing, specifically cheese. So whey protein is almost like a chicken broth, a soup. It is popular among athletes to encourage muscle growth, and here we're starting to talk about more of the isolate form of whey protein, or WPI, whey protein isolate. In the top right, you can see the processing used for whey protein. It is isolated, purified, goes through RO multiple times, and then you end up with something that is up to 92% protein. Recently, in the literature by Professor Tim Douglas, he had started to show that whey protein encouraged osteocyte adhesion. He went on to study different bone implants that were coated with WPI. Once I came across this and I understood the nutritional quality of whey protein and the fact that it had interesting cellular characteristics, which as a mechanical engineer, I learn more and more about every single day, that's when I became very interested in applying it to our own work. Now, while whey protein is new to us, alginate is not. Alginate, other polysaccharides, plant and animal-based, is stuff I've been working on for over 20 years. Our group has experience fabricating different alginate hydrogels, different chemical modifications, and the materials that we create are tailorable based on a slew of variables and parameters used to create these materials. So now I would like to take you through 3 different generations of what we have made based on whey protein. So this was our first study where we looked at a continuation of some of the tissue engineering for the medical field into food. Now I recognize that some of the work we're doing is not food grade, but here we are trying to engineer and optimize a program. Once we understand how these two different blended materials react, then we're able to fine-tune it and go down and work with food-grade chemistry and materials. But for a proof of concept, we wanted to look at combining whey protein and alginate. The first way that we did this, no pun intended, that will happen a lot. The first way that we did this was we covalently conjugated the alginate to itself and to the whey protein via a methacrylation chemistry. This was green light cross-linked using various photoinitiators, and we created 3 different materials. One without whey protein, one where the whey protein was not modified, and then in the other one, everything was modified. We cross-linked everything. So what we found, and by the way, on the left side of the graph, on certain slides, I will have some of the methods that we used, but I don't really want to focus on those. If you have questions, please look at the literature or come find me or Dr. Tahir. He's in here somewhere. He did most of this work. So one of the biggest things that I'm interested in is mimicking the mechanics of tissue, whether that's for medicine or for what we're eating. Now, this was started almost 4 years ago. So a little bit before I started appreciating all of the food science and the meat science that was going on. But initially, we wanted to look at these 3 different materials, whether or not there was an effect with WPI and alginate alone, or if we had to covalently cross-link them. So we look at the swell ratio, not surprisingly, whey protein, having some hydrophobic functional groups, reduces the swelling of our hydrogel. But then when we look at the weight loss, this is where we start to get information about our material. If whey protein is not conjugated to the alginate, it can come out, even though there is an electrostatic interaction between the 2 of them. When we covalently cross-link everything, surprisingly, the mechanical properties went down as well. So this is something we started looking into. We weren't quite sure why this was happening. So we looked at cells. Now, understanding that some of the material came out, specifically in the whey protein, the middle row, the non-conjugated whey protein, I want to keep in mind that when these materials lose weight or degrade in media, they're releasing protein. Just keep that in mind. So it may not be bad that our materials degrade. We have yet to find out the specific advantage of this, but it's not bad. I think all of this is very good. So when I looked at the whey protein that was conjugated to the alginate, we indeed saw enhanced cell adhesion. And we credited this to the whey protein. So here we are looking at whey protein specifically as the cell adhesive component. But we continue to look at other materials, and here I'll start with my Gen 2. So here we stepped away from covalent cross-linking, photo cross-linking. We stepped away from methacrylation. And here, we did a modification of the alginate to create a dialdehyde. In doing this, we were able to create a conjugation with the whey protein. Now, I'm still using whey protein. We actually purchased it from Fonterra. But here, what I'm showing chemically is the beta-lactoglobulin. Beta-lactoglobulin is the highest, it's the protein that has the highest amount in whey protein. And we believe, based on the literature, that this specifically is what cells are adhering to. So we create a shift-based bond between alginate and the beta-lactoglobulin, and then we use calcium cross-linking to cross-link the alginate chains together. Therefore, we got a 3D structure. We continue to look at our weight loss. This time, we went 7 days and beyond. But what we find is after the material acclimates in whatever aqueous environment it is in, it really doesn't change. So even though it seems like it degrades and it loses weight, that structure really will not change in weight over a week. Okay, so we keep going. Now with each generation, we're trying to get closer and closer to food grade, but I'm also trying to get closer and closer to understanding the mechanical properties. So I want you to pay attention to the images that are on the top right and the bottom right. First, let's go to the top right. Modulus, that's stiffness. Most of us understand stiffness is the resistance to compression or tension. In this case, we're talking about compression, pushing two things together. We looked at the compression test specifically looking at different strain ranges. So what does that mean? That means that as we take a bite of steak, for example, you will bite it a little bit, and there'll be some resistance there. You'll go to bite it again. Maybe a little bit more resistance because you've compressed the material. You keep going, and that is exactly what we see. As you continue to compress the material, and if we look at the slope of the stress strain curve, which, there we go, we took different ranges from 10 to 20%, 20 to 30, and so on, and you do indeed see the stiffness increase. The idea is not only to match the stiffness of the meat, of muscle, but to give the consumer the same experience mechanically. And so I am taking this from a traditional solid mechanics, materials engineering approach. So we continue to go further. We looked at cells. Now we used our alginate dialdehyde. We used our alginate dialdehyde mixed with WPI, and those were all calcium cross-linked. And then we added glycerol. This, we wanted to see if it would change the fabrication or the final properties of the material. What we found, not surprisingly, is that the WPI did increase cell adhesion. Here specifically, we don't have numbers, but on the top right, that is a migration assay. So we see that the cells are motivated by this protein. Do I want to go beyond 7 days or even 24 hours? Absolutely, especially after looking at Mark's graphs where they go up to like 90 days. Yes, let's see if we can do that without driving my students crazy. But we were motivated by this. And again, we're using whey protein. So if I take a step back for a moment, it's not necessarily on my slides, but whey protein is a big problem. And although we don't like to talk about using animal proteins or animal materials in this field, I am trying to bridge both. So before I move on, I just want to say that I think it is important to upcycle the wasted food that we have now, agriculturally. And the dairy industry is hurting for a solution. What if we could be that solution? So then I give that pitch to multiple people, and companies are like, we don't want to do it. And I say, that's fine. Did you guys know that people are fermenting dairy proteins? And a lot of you do know that. Great. So there is a way to take the cow out of the equation. We have already done the work, looking at the engineering of these proteins, looking at the engineering and the solid mechanics of how we create these hydrogels, and now this was almost like our last test. Is it the beta-lactoglobulin? This work has yet to be published. We're in the process of writing this up, but so far, no one has shown this work. And I find it critically important that we all take a step back and realize that people have been drinking whey protein shakes for a very long time to grow muscle. So what we did here in our fabrication technique, by the way, we use all additive manufacturing techniques in the laboratory. Here we just did a solution casting in a mold. So we took whey protein that is very similar to what we did before, but now we're including beta-lactoglobulin. On top of that, we wanted to look at some of the other industry standards, if you can call them that, where we look at gelatin, RGD modified alginate, and again, we threw in our BLG. So if we look at the left, I don't have the graphs to show you the swell ratio and the weight. I mean, I have the graphs, but I'm not showing them to you. Here, I think the visual is very important. Some of these materials do break down. And let me go through some of these acronyms because I realize they're not on there. W is for whey protein. The B is for beta-lactoglobulin. The G, gelatin. R, RGD alginate. And then the A is just plain alginate. Now the images on the right where we look at the compressive stiffness, again, we calculated this from a certain strain range on the stress strain curve. we looked at all of those different variables that you can use for a hydrogel. Concentration, weight ratios, what's the solution, the electrolyte concentration, temperature, all of that stuff. And so we thought we had some really defined engineered process of how we thought that all of these stiffnesses would go, and we were actually quite surprised. So on the graph on the bottom, you will see W-C. And then over here, you'll see W-S. The C stands for compliant. What does that mean? Soft. It's the inverse of stiffness. So S stands for stiffness. You will see that some of the compliant materials are actually stiffer than the stiffer ones. For that reason, you cannot believe words alone, right? You got to show me the data. So we took this, and while we were motivated by this, so if we take our different formulations and our different materials, we're able to get a slew of different properties, regardless really of whether or not this is RGD modified alginate or not. So we can modify this slightly chemically. Here, we're only playing with some of the blended materials with the alginate, but still, through optimization of different parameters, we can actually start to mimic the properties of these tissues. So on this graph, I wanted to present the data multiple ways. First, this is 24 and 72 hours, so not quite extensive, but extensive in our world of being frustrated with cells, to be quite honest. We like to make and break things. That's why I chose my profession. But the graph on the bottom here, you can see that this corresponds to this being the stiffest material, so on the previous graph. As we go down, the materials on the right will decrease in stiffness. They become softer. For those of us familiar with the mechanotransduction field, we know that the stiffness and the properties of that material are going to have an effect on the cells. We also know that the composition of that material is going to have an effect on the cells. Do they work together? Do they work against each other? Can we make a prediction? Not always. So what we see here is that these myoblasts, we were able to get, so here is our whey protein, our alginate. So this is used with Fonterra. It is our engineered material that we have published on before. And then here we have our beta-lactoglobulin. Here's our RGD alginate, which, by the way, you can modify any way you want. I could have made that look terrible, or we could have made it look great. So we wanted to be aggressive. That's what we would expect with RGD. With gelatin, you didn't see that much of a difference, which we were surprised by, considering that's sort of the norm in the industry. The alginate control, you get some cells that absorb, but they don't really adhere, and they start to come off and die afterwards. And now if you look at our whey protein and then the specific protein beta-lactoglobulin, the reason why you kind of get this hazy green is that I am showing you planar images, just 2D images. If we were to take a stack through that material, you see the cells moving through that material after we seeded it on top. So then the material starts glowing. But we went ahead and just moved forward with these 2D images. Another thing that Dr. Tahir did real quick before he left is he wanted to see how these materials were behaving on the material. So we had to use scanning electron microscopy. We fixed the cell. We just wanted to make sure there was a cell there. It was doing its thing. It's there. It's doing its thing. That's one picture. But we're continuing to move on and progress through this. So after we realized that whey protein could be beneficial, not only can we upcycle agricultural waste, but we can actually help out those in our field who are fermenting beta-lactoglobulin. But as I mentioned before, the technical risk going into this field I was well aware of. I needed to be high in protein. I needed to supplement whatever was going to be made in the lab, meat-wise. And then it needed to taste good. So many people started telling me, did you eat it? Did you eat it? And I was like, no. You know, we also do like chemotherapeutics research in my lab, no way. So we had to move out of house, essentially, and we moved into my lab for Burlington Bio. And this is where we started playing with the food. So what we see on the top left is our nutritional analysis. It came back from Eurofin, and this is our scaffold. Not surprisingly, it's full of protein, but we can tailor that, essentially. So by ensuring that we have the mechanical properties we want, then it's just a little bit of design and engineering to tailor the weight ratio between our carbohydrate, which is the alginate, and our protein, which is the whey protein. Now, as I mentioned before, if you're using whey protein, it's 92% protein. Whey protein isolate is like 92% protein, but there's other stuff in there. There's salts, there's fats, so we do come back with some ash content. But in those top images here, this is where we're playing with the material and we started cooking it. We wanted to heat it up. We wanted to see what happened. And then beyond that, how fun is that? That's not that fun, right? I mean, it's fun, but it's a glob in a dish, and everyone looks at globs and dishes. What we wanted to do is extend beyond this. You have your microcarriers, you have your scaffolds. Could you make noodles? What if you want meatball and spaghetti and the meatballs are grown on the spaghetti? Why not? Students had a lot of fun doing this. So what we see is after we got the nutritional analysis back, and again, all the materials that we make are engineered to translate to additive manufacturing techniques. We're able to extrude, 3D print, compression mold, all of these things to create various materials. So here, if we take our hydrogel, we can grind it down, and we get what we're calling a flour. We take our flour, and we replace it with flour, real flour, like King Arthur flour, for those of you in the Northeast Kingdom. Probably no one here. Okay. Famous flour from Vermont. Yes, some people know. Okay, fantastic. So we created a dry pasta. So just like any other material, we created a hydrogel, we lyophilized it. Good, pasta. And then we cooked it, boiled it. Looked like pasta, kind of tasted like pasta. But we decided to move on from that. So that's fun. And maybe someone here can get an idea that we don't need the traditional scaffolds. We can look at different things. And in fact, everyone here is so concerned, me too, about surface area and trying to increase biomass. We can create materials that have high surface area without necessarily needing to go to microcarriers. So the other thing that people are looking into is hybrid meat. So we did not grow this meat. Please understand, we did not grow this meat. This is hamburger bought at the store. But we blended it with our material, our hydrogel, which you see right here. So I have a professional chef in my lab. He is a graduate student. I'm very lucky to have him. So he looked at blending different ratios of our hydrogel and mixing it with hamburger. And to be honest, his big initiative is, can we take 1 pound of burger and turn it into 2? So when I say a binder, that's a better way, I think, than misleading all of you into thinking that that's cultivated meat. But we went through a sensory analysis, and we did a scoring. And if you take very, very low fat hamburger and mix it in with our scaffold, it was pretty similar to a high fat content hamburger. And we were pretty surprised with that. So now, real quick, what are we doing in the future? Directional freezing. We've been doing this for a while, but it's always fun to compare it to what's in nature. And this is something that Dr. Stout had published on initially, and then Dr. Tahir took over. Microcarriers, yes, of course. People want to know about microcarriers. And in my lab, if you want it, we'll try and make it, because that's just what we do. So these little beads, they were made with electrospraying. And the beads here, in this image, were actually made from waste. Waste that comes from a cheese factory that goes out the hose. So we have isolated whey protein alginate, and here we have the whey protein sludge that comes out of a factory that has not been processed. The other thing we're looking at is microporous structures, controlling not only the size distribution, but the overall size, and as I mentioned before, the directionality. All right, I have 35 seconds. Okay, so I just want to thank all of the funding that I've gotten. It's not enough, but thanks anyways. And then you will see some of Professor Kaplan's students sneaking in here, but what can I say? We love to ski. So if anyone wants to come up and ski with us, please do. But I want to point out the 3 major people who did all of this work. I'm just sitting there awed and amazed at everything they do. So here is Chef Kevin Markey. He's the one who's cooking this work and will eventually teach us how to create these materials so that when they're cooked, actually cooked at home, they give those properties that all of us want. Chris Foley, he is currently in the depth in the trenches of his PhD, going through all this work, putting together a paper. And then here, as I mentioned before, the famous Dr. Irfan Tahir. If you don't know him, go say hi to him. He's the friendliest person I know. He was the one who was vital. So before I met Irfan, I really thought that my passion for research was over. I was making joint replacements so that people could go back out on the golf course. Ugh. Okay, yeah. But then, when these individuals surrounded me, told me that everything I was doing could be used to feed people, forget it. I'm not part of you. I'm part of this community forever and ever. It is critical. I have 3 children. It is critical that we take care of this. So yes, I do have a startup. Here are the people in our little company trying to get this work done. But if anyone has any questions, please ask. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Rachel, for this very creative use of biomaterials and cooking and introducing that. Any questions for Rachel? Yes, over here.
Hi. So you mentioned that you use cheese waste to extract alginate, right?
Oh, no, we don't use cheese waste to extract alginate. We use the cheese waste is where we get the whey protein.
Right.
And then we actually blend that with other polysaccharides such as alginate to create our gel.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
No,
Thank
that's
you.
okay. Yeah.
That was it.
Over there. While the microphone is moving that way, I can ask a question too.
Oh.
Right. So do the cells actually grow into this material? Or
Do they
because
grow?
you show on top and somewhat below there, but do they actually grow into it?
They do, yes. So we do have confocal images. They're not the prettiest, but they do migrate into the material. But so far, we've only made materials that are maybe 200 microns thick. Okay. So we haven't made like a full, thick, 2-centimeter steak-like thing and had them travel all the way through. I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that the mechanics of the materials, if they change, we understand them, or if they don't change, we understand that. And then I want to go to longer time points, because then we're going to probably start dealing with differentiation, whether we want it or not. And so then the migration, all of that stuff will change. But They do migrate into it. They seem to like the whey protein.
They will, trust me.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
Excellent talk. Thank you so much. So I saw when you did the nutritional analysis that it was your composition was fairly low in fat. But when you did the blended cooking, you said that it was similar to a high fat content burger. So can you comment on what you think is happening with your gels that's contributing to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of it has to do with a specific reaction that's taking place when we cook it. So even our scaffold itself, we can cook it, and it goes through a Maillard reaction, and that changes the flavor and the texture. Also, because our hydrogel, we can tailor the moisture content, that also sort of gave it like, I don't want to say a fatty flavor, but almost like that sort of juicy consistency. But it really has to do, I believe, with the chemical reaction that's taking place between the protein and the polysaccharide within our hydrogel. And then, of course, when you have those go through the reaction with the surrounding meat as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Floreani, for this cool talk. I love the idea. I love cheese. I don't think they're ever going to shut off the whey pipes, so I think you're good on your waste stream there. So your repurposed whey kind of looks like it could serve as a food ingredient in of itself. Have you looked at how the cells or differentiated cells change those mechanical properties? Do they enhance it? Like, yeah, I'm curious. And also, second question, does the acrylate chemistry pose any toxicity or health concerns?
Oh, yeah, no. We moved away from the acrylate chemistry, actually. And to be honest, the photo cross-linking is too long, I think, for scalable, quick food manufacturing. Too long. What was your first question, James?
Yeah, so the whey waste as a functional food ingredient in of itself, and how the cells might change the textural properties.
Yeah, very good questions. We know the cells are going to change. We've done mechanical testing on the materials after cells have been on there, but I don't think the cells are on there enough because the cells have to start to lay down their own matrix. And once they do that, the properties are going to change. So we're looking at both the metabolism of the material by the cells, the degradation just hydrolytically of the material, and then once we make sure that we have the cells on there that we want and that they're not turning into something we don't want, then the idea is to do all the mechanical testing. The texture, I think, is going to be a little bit different. But in terms of functional food, yes. I do think that there's a place for some of the materials that a lot of us are working on just in terms of food, just increasing nutrient density for the foods that we have out there today. And if I can just take 10 seconds, a lot of the food that is sold in rural areas is super processed, and it doesn't have a lot of nutrients. So one reason why one of my students wanted to make the noodles is we wanted to see if we can make a better Kraft macaroni and cheese, essentially. And so cultivated meat and feeding the world is critical, but it's baby steps. So if we can create something like a noodle that is going to give someone in suburb Detroit more nutrients, that's great. We can also put meat on it too. I think that we will be able to do that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.